Hello, here I am recording the the midterm review again. So I want to clarify some things that are important that I didn't have a chance to say in class. First of all, in terms of what's going to be in the exam, I said the case studies and the slides, but obviously the slides are from the readings. So you need to do all the readings. You have all of these readings that we did: framework for strategy, framework for the segmentation targeting reading, and then the brand positioning reading. So those really are the three readings that most of my slides are based on. Now, I do add a lot of things that are not in the readings, but the readings are essential. So if you study from the review that I'm making, that's fine, but you should also do the reading. So here they are, just in case. So the readings for the exam, let's go all the way over here. This one, marketing strategy, segmentation, and positioning. Okay. Second semester, we'll do digital. And in terms of the case studies, we did Red Lobster, and we did Pantene. Actually, the best way is to go over here. Sorry, to go all the way over here. So we did three case studies. We did Starbucks. Best thing is to go over your assignment questions and your notes. We did Red Lobster and we did Pantene. We didn't have a chance to do Lululemon, so just those three case studies. And another place to find them is right here, right? So you have Starbucks, Red Lobster, Pantene. So, and you have the assignment questions. So it's not going to be very different than that. I also told you that in the case of Pantene, we went through every single graph and table. So that's something that you should be familiar with as well. So I'm going to go over the slides now that I realized during class that I was able to finish early. It gives me a chance to do it a little bit slower and a little bit more detail. So let's and here I can see my recording so that I know that it is recording. So early on, obviously, kind of the definition of marketing. By the way, these are three individuals that, or two individuals that you should be very familiar with. I mean, the only one that we're missing here is Kotler. The purpose of business is to create a customer tracker. Theodore Levitt, who wrote Marketing Myopia, which you all should remember because he's considered the father of marketing. He basically said, marketing myopia is basically when you're focused only on the product and not on the need, right? So the famous example he gives is you're interested in how to get a quarter-inch hole and not a quarter-inch drill. So this is kind of the whole mentality of marketing change that now we focus on the customer. One of Kotler's biggest contribution was he said, yes, keep a customer, create a customer, keep a customer, but also at a profit. So achieving financial goals requires differentiating on what you do and how you operate. So the other level already started giving us some of the strategic concepts that we'll go over in a moment. But basically, marketing is about creating customer value. And there is essentially two major approaches: the selling concept or the marketing concept. The selling concept starts with the product, and then you focus how to sell those products in terms of sales and promotions. The marketing concept is you start with the market and the needs. And I'd like to say the best way to think of needs is you're solving a problem. You're solving a problem, right? So transportation, and by the way, solving a problem could be that you figure out a way to do it better. So transportation started with horses, and And then we went to automobiles, and now we have self-driving automobiles. So over time, there are different ways to meet those customer needs. And you need what is called an integrated marketing campaign or an integrated marketing program. Let's call it program because program is includes everything. So here, the focus is how to become profitable through sales volume, right? So basically, a lot of times these are low cost producers, and they're focused on scale. Here, profit through customer satisfaction. So this is a big difference because, as we'll see in a moment, it's really about creating customer value through our marketing activities. So the framework we've been using in this class is the framework used at HBS and has been pretty much adopted by most. If you look at marketing management by Kotler, the most famous marketing textbook in the world, the framework is almost identical. What I like about this framework is that it's very common sense, right? You start with a customer in the middle. Remember, customer, buyer, consumer, end user. And then you have external factors, competition, context, collaborators, which basically drive opportunities and threats. And you have internal factors, which is the company itself and its strengths, weaknesses. And the goal is to create a sustainable competitive advantage, or what Warren Buffett calls a moat. Now, we're constantly analyzing these things because they change. They change over time. The company's capabilities and strengths and weaknesses may change over time given the nature of these other factors. So, customer needs, or the way they are fulfilled may change, habits. You have all sorts of differences now with technology. So, and the nature of competition can also change. Collaborators are outside players that allow you or help you achieve your goals, right? So if you're working through distributors or retailers, or in the case of, like, for example, if you're using cloud services, like if you have a software as a service, and it resides on AWS, Amazon Web Services, that is a potential collaborator. And then context is the macro environment. The macro environment, so everything that is going on in the macro environment affects everybody, and then everything's going on in the industry. So this is constantly changing, and typically most companies review these things once a year. Then you need to make certain decisions, right? So these are kind of, what are your aspirations? Your aspirations is, what value are you trying to create and for whom? So you start by doing segmentation, then you choose your target. It could be one or more segments, and then you're positioning on how you're going to position yourself versus other competitors. And this drives to outcomes in terms of, if you do all these things right, then you acquire new customers, you retain existing customers, and the ultimate goal is to create brand ambassadors. And brand ambassador is not somebody that you pay to promote your product. Brand ambassador is somebody that is so loyal, okay, that becomes an advocate. So these are a lot of the people who basically word of mouth or through YouTube or through many other ways bring you new customers because they are brand ambassadors. Now, in order to achieve all this stuff and eventually the ultimate, which is sales profits and brand franchise or equity, and market position would be, some sort of leadership position, you need an action plan. So this is your marketing mix. So the marketing mix has the strategic part of it and the execution, and we'll talk about both in a moment. So for example, in the case of product, I'm going to introduce a new product with a new fragrance to fulfill this need among XYZ target consumers. So that's kind of, what the strategic reason for the product is. Now, the plan is kind of okay. So if it's a new product, you need to project manage this new product introduction. So it's all the steps to get that product into the marketplace. So in this, for this exam, we're focused on the five C's, STP, product. Now remember that product also incorporates positioning. Sorry, product also incorporates branding. Okay, so a big part of product branding. The second part of the semester, we're going to focus on promotions, place, and price, and implementation. So, what do we mean by that? Well, you start with a marketing strategy, but then after that, you need a marketing plan. Basically, it has a horizon of what you're going to do, say, in the next fiscal year. You have a budget. So, typically, you have a budget meeting where you show all of your plans, and then if oh hopefully they'll get approved. Here is really about allocating, and then getting agreement. Say, like when you're asking for funding, right? You're asking for funding. So this, in corporations, this gets approved, and then you can start implementation. Now remember that if you have something that is going to take 3 months for planning, you may start your implementation early on. So this part is really a lot of project management, a lot of project management. And then, kind of throughout, once you achieve these things, then you need to monitor. You want to monitor what's going on. So you look at market share, you look at sales, consumer monitor. These are things that are usually like every 3 months, and you can see consumer satisfaction, or these are like regular reports. Um, and then you can do more in-depth analysis and research of everything. So you have, usage and attitude studies, because at the end of all of these, what you're trying to do, and this is, it ends here, but it then continues again every year, is you're trying to figure out what worked and what didn't work, so that you can maybe do again what has been working, and obviously do not continue doing the things that didn't work. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about more the consumer and the customer. So, first of all, consumer behavior is very much affected by different factors. And here we see four buckets that includes a lot of these factors, or the most important factors. So cultural, again, so here we have an example. So, in my case, being from Venezuela, I'm very much influenced in my consumer behavior on the food that I eat and what I buy every week, because this is part of my culture. The Super Bowl show, I could identify a lot more because it had to do with my culture. Social, okay, has to do with the people you're with. So it could be your social network of people, and the most common influence is usually the people who are closest to you. So like your family, right? Now, personal, we have different stages to our life cycle. We change occupations. Early on we're students, then we get into the workplace. Depending of our economic situation, we may change habits that influence our behavior. So, for example, when I started working, we all had to wear suits and tie. So we had to adapt. Lifestyle, personality. So then with the people or the situation you're in, then you change over time. If you're starting a family, then you focus probably on your kids. And then when you retire, then you focus on other things. And then we have psychological. So this is the tough ones, right? Because a lot of it has to do with motivations, perception, beliefs, and attitudes. And this is the hard part, because this is what we call the black box. It's your brain. So, we have all of these factors, and then you can have people who look at the same thing with completely different perceptions or beliefs, as we all know. So, the other thing that is important is, in the buying decision process, who is the decision making unit? So decision making unit In a family, it could be, I don't know, one of the parents, right? But in a company or business to business, this becomes a lot more relevant because you need to identify who are the gatekeepers, who gets to decide, who is the actual buyer, who uses your product, and who influences that information, right? So you may have, if it's in the case of maybe the veto power is the dean, right? Influencers could be the professors. Users could be the students. Champion could be somebody, so let's say it's IT related, people from IT. And then economic buyer is maybe just the accounting department. And you may actually even have a compliance officer to make sure that this process is done within the regulations and the rules of the company. So these are examples of different types of advertising. So here we have cognitive, this is the thinking stage. Emotional, this is the feel stage. And here this is, so sorry, this is a combination of cognitive and emotional, which is the rational and the feel stage. And here we have emotional, which is only feel, right? So a lot of the appeals are done with cognitive and emotional. Something that could be very cognitive is just making a straight comparison, like a price. Okay, so we talked about consumer behavior factors, we talked about the decision making unit. Now we need to talk about the decision making process. So we kind of go through, all of us, through this process. It's just like when you're buying soda, this takes seconds. But if you're buying a car, this could take weeks, right? So you have your need recognition, you look for information, evaluate the alternatives, and then you make your purchase decision. But then it's also important your post-purchase behavior, because if you purchase something and then, so this is why we have this so-called, by P&G's coined, first moment of truth and second moment of truth. So first moment of truth is, what do you do to get somebody to purchase? Everything that goes before the purchase, and particularly as you get closer to that purchase decision. Second moment of truth, what happens when you use the product? Okay, because if you use the product and it's not good, then you're not going to buy it again. So, and that's why testing is done to do that. So, like I talked in the classroom with Waku, great packaging, catches your attention, but then when people tried it, a lot of people didn't like it. So this is post-purchase behavior. There is things like cognitive dissonance and all this stuff that is basically how you may regret your purchase decision. The other thing is, this also depends very much on what is called involvement. High involvement products usually have a long decision making process. So these, think of involvement almost like in terms of price. Low involvement products are very quick. So basically, you can go through all of these steps when you look at your target. And here's an example of business to business, where it's even more prolonged because you have things like a request for a proposal, and then you have a bidding process, and you have all sorts of things. So the important thing is understanding who are who is involved in the buying decision, who are the key roles, and what is the process. Okay, so one of the concepts that is most important to understand is the marketing funnel and the customer journey. So the marketing funnel are the different stages you go through, from the top of the funnel, which is the awareness stage. Then you have the middle of the funnel, which is the consideration and interest stage. I like to split it to, as a matter of fact, interest and consideration, because first I need to make you interested, and then you consider buying it. So, sorry, here you have it, interest and consideration. So these are the two main sections of the middle of the funnel. And then bottom of the funnel, which is conversion, basically the purchase, right? Now, we'll talk later on about different tactics and objectives for each of the different stages. Here, we're just looking at the stages and how customers go through this journey through each of the different stages through something called the customer journey. So this is conversion or purchase conversion, and then you have post purchase. So retention, which is loyalty, and advocacy, another way of saying creating brand ambassadors. So you want them to hopefully recommend your brand. So the way the customer journey works is you have positive experiences, negative experiences, and neutral experiences. Positive experiences drive you forward, or you can think about from top to bottom of the funnel. So what we have is messages and media. Okay, so different messages could be different or maybe the same. So here I became aware of some product because of word of mouth. Then I showed interest because I saw an email and I clicked on the link, or maybe an ad, a display ad, or a banner ad, and you clicked on the ad, or maybe in social media. So that shows interest, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't click on it. Now you're in the landing page. You're considering if you're going to buy it or not. Okay. And let's say the landing page is e commerce. You can then make the purchase decision right here. Or maybe if it's an omni channel strategy, then you look at all the information. So let's say it's Apple, right? You're looking at the iPhone information, the new iPhone or whatever in the website, but then you decide you don't want to. I want to try it, touch it before I buy it, so I go to the store. So these are the different touch points. Now, negative could actually have the opposite effect. So let's say you already purchased something, right? And you read some review or a friend tells you, look, let's say it's a restaurant, they changed the owner, they changed the cook, now it's a completely different place, and then you say, oh, okay, well, if that's the case, I'm not going to come back. So these are negative. Now, most of the time, we are in what is called the neutral stage. A lot of things, you don't notice. That's why you don't remember most of the ads that you saw in the last 48 hours. So this is kind of the neutral stage. So you're really not going through a customer journey because you haven't even been able to capture the initial phase, which is the awareness and capturing their attention. Another thing that is very important is the different adoption periods, or also there are like risk profiles. So whenever you have a new product, and this is particularly important with startups, you have innovators. Innovators are those people who are always looking for the newest thing, okay? And often these could be like beta users. Sometimes these are grouped together. They shouldn't, because innovators sometimes are not paying customers. Early adopters are usually paying customers. So these are people who are willing to take risks. They don't mind if the product is not finished. They try it. Now, what happens is 75%, 75 to 80% don't make it to what is called the early stream. Even big companies, right? So what is called Apple Vision, they discontinued it because it never got to the early mainstream. On the other hand, when you're successful, so this whole thing, there is a framework called crossing the chasm, and that's the basis of part of, or a big part of my entrepreneur marketing class, is how do you get here? What is the strategy to guarantee the biggest success to get into the mainstream? So you can do the buying process and then segment farther by each type of shopper. So you have habitual shoppers, okay, and then you can have a tactic for that, so that it triggers something for them to buy the product. Value seekers who are looking for price deals, lovers. So these are people who usually go to the mall and they're looking at all different things and maybe they buy something on impulse. High involvement shopper. So this is, again, high involvement is usually things that take time. So here you have seeks expert advice, right? So a high involvement product, like we've talked about, is an automobile. So maybe this process is going to be prolonged and it's going to require different things. Now, when it comes to marketing research, the process really should always start with formulating the problem. What is it that you're trying to achieve? What is your goal? Okay. So when I worked at P&G, people think, oh, P&G spends so much money in research. But in order for me to justify any research, I had to fill out this marketing research request, which was a long form with a lot of information. So it was basically like, what is going to be the return on investment of investing all this money on this research? So once you do that, then you look at the different type of sources of information. So it could be primary or secondary, which we'll talk a little bit about in a second. And then you choose the most appropriate data collection method. If it's something that requires quantitative research, then that will be broader and probably more expensive. If it's something where you're maybe just screening some ideas, then it could be something as simple as focus groups. Or maybe is some sort of A/B testing, which can be done quickly in online with Meta or Google or any of these digital tools. So then you collect the data and then analyze and interpret the data. And what do we want to know? Well, it depends what the objective of the research was. So if you're trying to generate new insights, maybe you're looking at habits and practices to see if there is any new habit, consumer habit, that you want to put into your advertising, for example. So again, the big two categories, primary, secondary. Primary is things that you can find online and they're existing in public domain. Usually these are available to everybody. They don't have to be free. Sometimes you have to pay. Like Nielsen is available for everybody, but it's very expensive. I'm talking about the Nielsen panel data. This is the sales data that is published, on terms of sales. Now, you may hire Nielsen to do a primary research, which is research for you and only for you, and then you go to the field and conduct it. Primary could also be qualitative, like focus group, but this data usually is proprietary and is not available to anybody else. So here we have an example of an A/B testing, or you can do conjoint analysis, but now a lot of the things are done with A/B testing. What did I do? Okay. So actually, this is an example of by doing this type of analysis, what are some of the things that you can achieve? So you can achieve a perceptual map. What I'm going to change the where this slide goes because perceptual maps is a big part of positioning, and I don't, when we talk about perceptual maps, we can just show it over here. Okay, so let's go back to where we were. Okay, so we talked about the customer, the consumer. Let's talk about the company. So here we're trying to figure out what are the company's strengths and weaknesses to hopefully have what Warren Buffett calls a moat. A moat, so the analogy or the metaphor, the castle is the company, the Lord is the CEO, and then you have all these factors that you may have advantage of, which creates a moat or a sustainable competitive advantage. And this moat really are barriers to entry. So if you have superior technology or very strong brand equity, or maybe you're more efficient than others, like Walmart, or in the case of Apple, the brand equity, and in terms of technology, let's say Toyota, in terms of reliability, if it's patented, you can also have barriers in terms of the five forces, which we'll talk about in a moment. Switching costs, large capital requirements. So these are all barriers that you have here so that your enemies, meaning your competitors, are not able to enter that castle. So this needs to be a very holistic approach. You need to look at all the different areas, not just marketing. So Michael Porter basically says competitive advantage resides in the value chain. So the value chain is basically looking at the whole corporation, but in terms of processes, supporting processes and core processes or primary processes. And you can see how marketing, sales, and even after sales is an integral part of the supply chain. So that's why it's called value chain, because this is, let's say, the supply portion of it, and this is the demand or downstream. Sometimes you go upstream and downstream. And then we had Prahalad and Hamill, who talk about core competencies. It says, you think of a company like a tree. And, the branches are kind of the products, and then the roots are your core competencies. So these are advantages that you have that you can use across many different products. So the example they gave in the video was Honda. Honda has a competitive advantage when it comes to engines. So they can use that competitive advantage not only in cars, but also motorcycles, generators, lawnmowers. So you can use it across many different products. So here is kind of, you can do an assessment of your marketing capabilities. So you have CRM, equity, all this stuff. So this is farther now. So this goes in more depth than just this checklist. So then we can move on to context. By the way, this is not in any particular order. Sometimes I often see sometimes context is what you do first, and then you do competition, and then you do company. Usually you always start with a customer, but I don't want to say always. Usually you start with a customer. There is nothing, when it comes to business and marketing, there is nothing set in stone. Okay. I have seen companies like Procter and Gamble and Disney and Pepsi and Coke and Kimberly Clark. They do things differently and are all very successful. Or in the technology, Apple, and so on. So how does it work? Well, all these macro factors basically affects your product mix and your strategy, which is just STP. And once again, in the middle, you have the customer. So what we're trying to figure out is how these macro factors affect your company and which ones are either opportunities or threats. So the example that now everybody's talking about is tariffs, right? So if you have a lot of imported inputs, or if you're reselling products that are imported, then tariffs is going to have a big effect, and it could be a big threat. Okay, inflation usually cuts across everything, or interest rates, so higher, because it's not only the higher cost of borrowing, but also, well, it really is the higher cost of borrowing. But inflation, if prices go up in gas, then it can go across many, many different areas. So how do you determine this strength and weakness? Well, you need to look at it in the context of competition. So at the macro level, you start looking at your industry. In your industry, you have Porter's five forces. And what Porter basically says is, in your industry, you have your direct competitors, right? So these are and if the rivalry is very intense, then that's going to affect profitability, because then you're going to end up in some sort of price war. But it's not only that. Buyers can act as competitors, because if they have a lot of bargaining power, they'll force you to lower the price and you'll be less profitable. So this whole analysis is to try to understand the profitability, the industry structure in terms of profitability. If there is a threat of a lot of new entrants, that will affect profitability. So in the case of Tesla, they didn't have to lower the price when they didn't have any new entrants. But then when everybody came into EVs, and on top of that, you have substitutes like hybrids and so on, then now all of a sudden you have a lot of competition and you have to lower your price. Same thing with suppliers. Suppliers have a lot of bargaining power. So when I always say, when I have my gas station, it's not like I could tell Coke or Pepsi what price I wanted to be in. And the way to think about bargaining power is this concept of BATNA, best alternative to non-agreement. And whoever has the best BATNA, if you don't reach an agreement, that's the one that has the highest bargaining power. So again, here we have the average profitability. Okay, return on invested capital is a little bit more fancy, but think of it as profitability. And then if we look at different industries, we have something as low as airlines and something as high as security brokers and dealers. So If you're looking at the industry and you're over here on the bottom, it's going to be very difficult to make money. You have to be basically the best to make money. But here, even if you're below average, you can still make money. So this is an interesting one. Perfume, cosmetics, and toiletries. That's why there is so many of them. Because even if you're not the best or if you have a niche, you can make a lot of money. So then we need to look at what are the factors that affect each of the five forces, right? So in the case of new entrants, what you're really interested in is looking what are the barriers. So for several years, the reason why a lot of companies were not going into the EVs is because capital requirements were very, very high. Okay. Then you have things like the network, the charging network. Customer switching cost is high too. Changing from to from one product. So the best example of this, well, here they have Microsoft Windows. Because the best example of this is if you're saying if you're changing from Apple, say, to Samsung, it's high switching costs because for now you need to learn a new operating system, and on top of that, the whole ecosystem you already had it configured for Apple. So there may be high switching costs. Then you have bargaining power of suppliers. So if there is few, so suppliers are more concentrated. So if there is only very few suppliers, so in the case of, when it comes to PCs, there is only basically one operating system. Well, there is more than one. You can also use the Google operating system. But there is very few suppliers. Actually, the example that I like the most is the one that was used in the Michael Porter interview, which is airlines. There's basically two or three manufacturers of engines and of airplanes. So it's not like the airlines have a lot of bargaining power. They basically have to buy from Boeing, from Airbus, Embraer, and then when it comes to engines, you have also a handful of engines. Bargaining power of buyers. So a lot of times, yeah, if you have a big buying group, so think of Walmart, or it represents a big part of your sales, that could be an issue. But typically, it's not so much about concentration, it's about switching costs. If customers have low switching costs, or if you have undifferentiated products, in other words, they have a lot of choices, then they will have a lot of power. So when I had my gas station, it was very easy to go to a different gas station. At the end of the day, gas is a commodity. Uh, so you look at that. Then you have substitutes, how closeness to the need it is. So we talked about hybrids being a potential substitute, but I like to think of scooters being a more interesting substitute in terms of transportation when you're nearby. So a lot of people used to bicycles and now they just use scooters, right? Rivalry among competitors. So again, if there is lack of differentiation, a lot of big fixed costs, excess capacity, product is perishable, so it's like bags house, you're going to have very intense competition. And that will eventually lead to some sort of price war. Um, so these are the most important five forces. These are other. So one is, so let me, so complements, I'm going to remove complements because this is something new and I want you to focus on the most important stuff. So then you have, so here you have the threat of new entrants, bargaining power of buyers, substitute, and rivalry. Those are really the big five. Now, what this is saying is, what can you do? Okay, if this is a structure, can you just do you stay still? Well, no. Okay, you can do things to improve your bargaining power versus suppliers. Okay, so for example, rivalry among competitors. Well, you want to have a more differentiated product. The more differentiated you are, the less you're going to be compared to your direct competitors. So this is kind of the process that you go through to do the analysis. These are the sources of information. So when we did the simulation, it was really what really changes is your willingness to pay. And willingness to pay translates directly to price. So let's look at a few of these again. Okay, so let's see. This thing should open. Okay. So basically, look at the willingness to pay. Willingness to pay is you as a customer, the perceived value you have of a product, and then how does affect price, cost, and profitability. Your willingness to pay has to be higher than price, otherwise people are going to buy you. There is always exceptions to this rule, right? if if you need to take the train and the price went up and you don't think it's worth it, maybe you have to take the train anyway. Okay, especially if you cannot walk or do other things. So willingness to pay, sometimes you may be forced to pay for something. Even so, when we had the supply shock of the pandemic, we were you would never pay $5 for a roll of toilet paper, but if you ran out of toilet paper, maybe you paid for it because there was no other choice. So let's see how this works. You have positive, neutral, and negative. So you are right now in a neutral stage, right? So let's say something changes. So we said in the case of Tesla, all of a sudden you had high threat of new entrants. So if the new entrants, the potential threat of new entrants, everybody's coming. Okay, so let's look at what happened. All of a sudden, willingness to pay goes down because you have more choices. And by the way, we saw this, right? Tesla had to lower their price, and now they are a lot less profitable, right? So if you see basically what we did here, if the threat is higher, profitability goes down because willingness to pay goes down and prices go down. And sometimes cost goes up because now there is more demand for the same components. So, you can get the worst kind of scenario. Bargaining power suppliers, they dictate the price. So, if the bargaining power of suppliers is high, then that's a negative because they dictate the price. So that affects really cost and profitability goes down. In the case of buyers, if they're willing to pay less because they have more choices, right? So they have more bargaining power. So here we see prices going down because they have more choices. And then if you have a threat of substitutes, so we talked about scooters, could be a substitute. Now, this is another issue again because you have more choices. So I don't want to talk about complements because this is something new that is being used to by some companies, but the ones really that was well, it's called five forces because these are the five: buyers, entrants, suppliers, substitutes, and competitors. Complements has to do with collaborators, and like I talked about in the example of, if your product depends on a platform like Amazon Web Services or Azure, that would be a complement. Okay, so what else do we have here? So strategy is really about making choices. So here we have a perfect example of Southwest. Southwest chooses not to have very convenient airports or an extensive network or onboard amenities, and they're fine if they don't do well in those because that's not their strategy. And the problem is that if you try to be what sometimes called all things to all people, then you don't do any of them right. Southwest is a low cost strategy. It's on a low cost strategy. They're a discount airline. If they do these things, then their costs go way up, and they lose, uh, in their positioning or competitive advantage versus other airlines. So here is an example of some sort of, strength and weaknesses analysis. So typically you do it based on data, right, or some sort of survey. And basically what you're looking at for this type of competitive matrix is the most important areas, the ones that people care the most, the things that are most relevant. Okay, so let's jump now to STP. There is often confusion between segmentation and targeting. Okay, segmentation is just grouping customer based on similar needs. And then you have a profile of each segment. Targeting is really assessing the attractiveness of each segment and selecting which segments you're going to target. Because in those segments, you have some customers that are already buying or potentially could buy, depending on if it's a new segment that is being created. And then positioning is how do you basically position yourself? How do you define your value proposition? Because in that particular segment, you may have other competitors. So this has to do with the differentiation, but it's not always differentiation. Your positioning could be the low cost. We'll go into detail in a second. So again, grouping, right? The most common or the ones that are used are usually geographics, demographics, psychographics, behavioral. Um, Psychographics is lifestyle, and one easy way to remember is AIO, activities, interest, and opinion. Behavioral has to do with benefits and usage of the product, life cycle in terms of adoption, and here you have some examples. So, what is the benefit of segmentation to the organization? So, this is something I didn't have a chance to review today, but it's really important. Well, for the organization, again, you don't want to be all things to all people. So, you're trying to identify those unfulfilled needs and match them to those products, product designs that you have the capabilities to do that. So you can also be more targeted in terms of promotion. So if you're doing advertising, instead of doing advertising to everybody, then you do advertising to different target groups. So we saw in the Zipcar example that we have different media and different message for each of the different segments, right? So we saw the college students very different message and medium than the one that is used for baby boomers. So hopefully this will increase also in higher customer satisfaction, which is ultimately what drives brand equity and value. Now, for the customer, this is also an advantage. So if you go to the cereal aisle and you're looking for, I don't know, low sugar oatmeal, then it's convenient. You find it what you're looking for. You have products that are tailored to those needs. Um, Relevant offers, well, if you're doing targeted promotions, then you're going to get targeted offers instead of any offer. So it's more personalized. So basically, this is basically how this model works. Now, in terms of selecting the targets, then what you do is you look at each of these segments and you look at it in three main dimensions. Uh, you will target this market if these dimensions are favorable. So is the segment big enough? Is it growing? Is it profitable? And then who's there already? What are their strengths? How intense is the competition between the players that are there already? How what about the resources? How deep pocket do they have deep pockets, meaning a lot of financial resources? Are you gonna if you get into a price war, usually the one with the most resources wins. Do you want to go into that type of situation? And then what is your company, you yourself, what are you trying to achieve? So what are you trying to grow by tapping into a new segment? So what is your objectives? Your competencies, your core competencies, do you have strengths or unique strengths to compete here? And then your resources. So if all of these are favorable, then you say, okay, so this is a target segment that I want to select. So undifferentiated would be you basically are all things to all people. So it's very undifferentiated. Differentiated is you may have more than one segment and you may have different products for each segment, or you may have different messages for each segment. Concentrated or niche is your focus on one small segment. It could be niche is usually referred to something small. So you have like the luxury segment, or maybe you just focus on one small geography. Micro marketing or one to one, this is what everything is moving to because now with recommendation systems and AI, you can do very much one-on-one or individual targeting. So again, here are examples of different segments, right? So you have hip nails, millennial moms, anti-millennials, gadget. So you create these different personas, right, based on all the information you get. And you can get it through different ways. You can do cluster analysis, which basically is usually done with machine learning to figure out the proximity between different customers. So here in terms of amounts spent and income. And then these have certain characteristics that you can then create into a persona. So let's say one of these clusters is budget conscious, but then again, what you're noticing is that they have certain hobbies, interests, behaviors, and if they're vastly different within the same democracy, demographics, you may want to create a completely different persona, right? So you may have a persona who is budget conscious but has completely different hobbies and interests. Now, why is this information useful? Well, in the past, you could only basically target based on very few things, mostly demographics. With interests or hobbies, you could do magazines, but it was very limited. Now with digital, you can use all this information, age, location, even you can even pinpoint like within 5 mile radius of a certain location. You can look at interests, behaviors, and go deeper and deeper. And here we have the meta manager. It starts giving you how many people with all those characteristics you can reach. So you can do a campaign for each persona. Okay, we already talked about the customer journey. So, by the way, if you go to your Google ad settings, you can see all the information that they've got gathered and the type of advertising you're getting. And if, for example, I don't want to get more advertising from Walmart, you can even control that. Okay, so let's move on to positioning. So, positioning, this is all about strategy, right? So, going back to Porter's competitive strategy framework, here is what he says. Yeah, basically, you have two choices: differentiation, lower price. But what's really important to understand is either one requires operational effectiveness. So you can't just if you're unique, but you don't meet certain criteria in terms of operation. Unique being unique is not enough. Okay, and competitive advantage is created through processes in the value chain. So the example I gave in class was, look, if you have a low cost airline like Southwest, but then the airplanes are not maintained and the bathrooms are not clean, then you're probably not going to use it. You need a certain minimum. So you're always trying to attain or surpass best practices. Okay. And then in terms of uniqueness or differentiation, what you're really doing is creating a unique value proposition. So you look which customers you're going to go after. That's your target, who's going to be your end users, what channels you're going to use. So that's your go to market. Which needs are you trying to fulfill? What are the features you're going to highlight? Okay. And how are you going to price yourself relative to your competition? So we have this thing called unique selling proposition. There's a lot of terms that have this thing: value proposition, selling proposition, unique selling proposition. Unique selling proposition really is about highlighting your most important value chain, right? And a lot of times you find them in the taglines. So M&M's, chocolate melts in your mouth, not in your hands. So at P&G, we say you need a catchy phrase in consumer language on your unique selling proposition. So bounty, quicker picker upper, right? So that's a creative way to basically define superior absorption. Tie, it's got to be clean, it's got to be tied. So basically, you just need to remove those stains, and you know that the one that is going to get it is tied. And Pampers, the driest diaper. This one's not very creative. Pantene, strong is beautiful. So when I was brand manager, it was Pantene, hair so healthy that it shines. But that now is going broader because shine, is very specific to one attribute of the hair. So strong is beautiful, something very short to the point. And so there is this thing called this 3C models of brand positioning. So we have consumer, competitive, and company. Okay. What we're trying to see is if we meet all the criteria to have something that is going to be a powerful positioning. So, from a consumer standpoint, is it relevant? Is our value claim relevant? Is it resonant? So, we'll talk about resonance in a moment when we look at the value, but it has to do how meaningful it is to the consumer. Is it realistic? Are you over promising or are you promising something that you can really deliver? Brand really is all about being a unique promise. And by the way, this is Kotler. I didn't make up this thing about being a promise. That's what Kotler calls branding is all about fulfilling a promise. Now, when it comes to competitive analysis, okay, so you have this unique value proposition, but how distinctive it is. If everybody's promising the same thing, then you're not very distinctive. How defensible is it? So is this something that is easy to copy and that you will not be able to claim? And even if it's defensible, is it durable? Will you be able to say that over time? So this was the issue with Bose, right? Noise reduction was very distinctive, defensible. Well, they had a patent, but once everybody did noise reduction, then it was not durable. So it stopped being a competitive advantage. Now, from a company standpoint, well, you can promise all these things and have all this strategy, but can you execute it? Is it feasible to do? Okay, can you manufacture? So in startups, often, you have people like uh, Ben Horowitz and Anderson and Peter Thiel, who are kind of like the gurus who always say it's all about, or Sam Altman, it's all about execution, right? So you may have the greatest idea in the world, but it will not work if you're not able to execute it, if you're not able to produce it. So that's why often in startups you have the product owner and the designer. The designer needs to be able in software, for example, to fulfill that that promise that you have. Then is it favorable? Does it help the rest of your company's portfolio? And faithful, is this something that really goes with your values, your mission statement and what you're trying to achieve? So, for example, in the case of P&G, we'll see later, decided to get out of the food segment because even though, for example, in the case of Pringles, Pringles would do really well here. The problem is that it was hard to defend because Frito Lay is just so much bigger, right? So when they came out with stacks, yeah, Pringles kept leadership in that particular type of crisps. But remember, potato chips, compete with all sorts of snacks. Okay. And in terms of the company analysis, P&G just didn't have the distribution that a Kraft or Nestle or Frito Lay have when it comes to food. It just didn't make any sense. Four types of value. So this is important because value is a term that is used a lot, but you need to differentiate between four different types. So the economic, that's very straightforward, right? Saving money, that's why you're valuing certain things. Functional, your basically focus on the features. So somebody's buying a phone because it has a superior camera, electronics. I talked about TVs. Every time there is like a 8K or OLED or no. So these are features. These are features. Experiential. Here we start getting in experiential social. We start getting into the emotional piece, right? The feel state. So these are intangible, psychological, emotional. So these are features associated with the brand that have to do with emotion. So we talked about things like friendship or sharing. In the case of Coca-Cola, well, sharing would probably be more community, social value. But we'll see a couple of examples in a second of experiential. The the one that we'll see very soon is Michelin. A lot is riding on your tires. So it's like, wow, my life is riding on your tires. So anyway, so this almost works like a ladder, right? And what you're trying to do is create resonance. Resonance is something that becomes really personal and meaningful. Okay, so how do we go? Well, you know, feature positioning. Dove early on basically talked a lot about containing one-fourth moisturizing cream. Very much features. Automobiles were all about, okay, this automobile has automatic transmission and all of these different features. So it was really more about features. So this answers what's in it. What's in that product, right? Now, second stage would be benefits, and benefits is what's in it for me. Okay, why? What need is this trying to fulfill? So here we have, this is very P&G. P&G focuses very much on benefits. Softer diaper wraps your baby, comfort and protection. So that's a positioning benefit. Oral B bends and adjusts contours teeth to remove more plaque. Again, another P&G brand acquired through Gillette. But when we go higher level, why is it important to me? So here you have L'Oreal, right? So this is great example of this emotional, doesn't talk at all about the product because you're worth it, okay? Or Michelin because so much is riding on your tires. So you're thinking from an emotional standpoint. When you think of Nike, just do it, right? There nothing about features or it's really about values and things that are emotional. So positioning statements, uh, you see different formats, but they usually all contain either all of these or most of these. What is the brand? What is your target? What is your brand promise or benefit? So this is usually your unique value claim. Where are you competing? So which segment market are you competing? Sometimes you can even put who are your main competitors. And then what is your reason to believe? Your reason to, why should I believe you? It could be, like we saw in Pantene, I believe Selena Gomez. Or it could be an animated demo, like we have in this commercial, of the Pro B vitamins penetrating the roots of the hair. So often, whenever you evaluate advertising, the way I learned to evaluate advertising was to separate strategic execution. Strategic is how well does it do the job of communicating all the strategic factors that are in your positioning statement. Okay, so how does it communicate the benefit? And it has this stunning hair visuals. Are they believable? Yeah. I mean, this is Selena Gomez. Is it unique? Well, if you do a really good job, then those stunning visuals are better than others, or they're different. Reason to believe, the vitamins clearly shown throughout the commercial. Brand recall, this is the most important one. You have product shots at the beginning, at the end, you have the use of the product throughout the commercial. Selling line, strong is beautiful. So can you see this unique value proposition? And what is it? So the value proposition, again, goes back to the selling line. Strong is beautiful. Do you see that in the ad? So these are the strategic factors. We, so at P&G, I was trained to really focus on this because the executional factors have to do with, they're more subjective, and this is more of the creative side. So in the executional factors, you want to look at things like, well, does the advertising keep you engaged? Does it build drama to want you to watch more? There is this thing called the 5 second barrier, which came from YouTube because you could skip commercial after 5 seconds, but now 5 seconds is more like 2 seconds. If you don't capture attention in the first 2 or 3 seconds, you're done. Does the execution overwhelm the problem, or does the problem overwhelm the solution? So sometimes, you have these Super Bowl ads where you remember everything about the celebrities and how entertaining it was, and you're like, what brand was it again? You don't remember the brand. So that's when money is wasted. And that's why you need, so there is the whole so called marketing rule of seven. People need to see something seven times. Again, it's an average, okay? It's not in every situation before they act on it. The casting and the celebrities, do you associate it with the brand character? So the brand character for Pantene, this is also a strategic piece of the brand, the branding, is somebody who is elegant, aspirational, but approachable. So this is the case of Selena Gomez. Is a celebrity, but you is somebody that you can identify with. The jingle, so in this case, the Selena Gomez song, is it catchy? Does it make you remember? Do you identify it? And you have things like the whistle for All Spice, the I'm somebody whistle, that you right away know what it is, right? So you have certain sounds that basically. So we have a professor here focuses basically on everything that has to do with sounds and how to create a branding element so powerful with sound. Is it memorable? Okay. And then if you run the volume test means, put it on mute, or even if you hear it in another language, can you understand the ad? Is it visually strong? So we have the so-called saying of a picture is worth 1,000 words. People remember images. They don't remember, often they don't remember words. And how to achieve brand recall? Product shots or the reason to believe? Is there some sort of demo? So you have sometimes side by side demos where you have Tide on one side and regular detergent on the other. You can see one room will sustain, the other one doesn't. And does the format work? So you have slice of life. This is like a real life situation. Vignettes could be like several types of, different videos that you show in different types of situation. Problem solution. So in the Pantene commercial, we see at the beginning split ends and so-called issues with hair, and then we see a solution. You can also have a presenter format. Presenter format is where somebody basically is talking about their products. So sometimes you have like founders of companies that will have a presenter, or in the case of toothpaste, we used a lot of times dentists, right? So it would be a dentist presenting why this toothpaste is superior. So what you're trying to achieve is the winning positioning spaces. So winning positioning spaces are these in green. So if you have a higher price, so here you have price and benefits. If you offer more benefits, yes, you can have a higher price. Obviously, if you have more benefits and the price is the same as your competitor, that's going to be good. And if you have more benefits at a lower price, so this was a situation with Walmart and Kmart, then that's going to be even better. Now, if you have less benefits, right, or the same benefits, and your price is lower, then that's fine too, right? So we saw Southwest, right? Walmart is a perfect example too. Um, and then you have less for less. So this is kind of like the dollar store kind of situation. That works too. Your issue, or you get into trouble, is when you have same benefits and higher price, or less benefits and higher price. So this is again the Kmart situation. They offer the same or even less benefit than Walmart, and often the price was higher because Walmart could undercut them. Right now, most of the time we're in this yellow frame, which is same benefit and same price. And companies fall into this type of price war situation because they have a hard time differentiating. So, during lunch, McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's, there is not much differentiation. By the way, Wendy's starting to close a lot of stores. Burger King is often in trouble, and McDonald's keeps winning in this game because they also have some differentiation, especially when it comes to breakfast. Right? They have a huge advantage over these others when it comes to breakfast. So often what we use is positioning or differentiating maps, sorry, positioning or perceptual maps, where you can put in different types of attributes and compare yourself versus competition. So here we have luxury and performance versus price. And we see that there is an issue here because we have Land Rover, right? A big part. So this is the large. So first of all, this is for a segment, large luxury SUVs. And then we have this smaller player, which basically almost stands for the same thing, which is Toyota Land Cruiser. So Toyota Land Cruiser, what they did is they moved to this space. They went lower in price. Okay. So they figure we can have the higher price and performance because we're losing in this game versus Range Rover. And one of the reasons also has to do with in the United States in particular, where you have Lexus, people are used to Lexus is the luxury brand. So why am I going to pay $100,000 for a Toyota when I can buy a Lexus? And so I'm often for less. So it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense. And then, so even the most luxurious version is almost at the same price as the Land Cruiser. So you can do all sorts of combinations of perceptual maps. But what they do is they allow you to understand the competitive environment and the point of differentiation. So this is the key thing, what you're trying to really achieve, right? So this is just, we use this simulation to do watches, and this was kind of the result that we came up with. So there is, then you can do perceptual maps based on more sophisticated research, like we saw in the case of Pantene and the Nielsen maps that were done. So Nielsen has all this association, they call it brand association mapping, that allows you to create all sorts of fancy maps. But the most important thing is what you're trying to do is understand, based on your competitive environment, your point of differentiation. You're doing more quantitatively, right? So when you're analyzing these things, what is it that we're looking for? What is the real estate that we claim? So think of the space as this is real estate. What real estate do my competitors claim? Which one is more valuable? So maybe you are in a space that nobody's in, but it's not generating any money. Okay. What is the most and least valuable territory in consumers' minds? So at the end of the day, it's all about the consumer mind. What do they perceive to be most valuable? And this is measuring willingness to pay. Which brands occupy those valuable spaces, and which ones are vulnerable? Which ones are closest to the location? So here we have a lot of these are very close, right? So Cadillac Escalade, Infinity, Navigator. So they're all very close to each other. And you know, when they're very close, then you can have how likely to encroach, meaning, you know, over a complete overlap. How crowded is the space? How do we compare versus our closest competitor? So this is the situation that we have here, right? If we are too similar, then we're going to have problems. So the other thing is which areas of the maps are not claimed. So going back to our example here, so you know, Toyota, notice this one is not claimed. So let's go over here with the Land Cruiser. Let's have a lower price. By the way, I think that's a mistake, but that's my personal opinion. How valuable are these spaces? Would you like to position yourself to those? By the way, the reason why I think it's a mistake is Land Cruiser worldwide is considered as the top of the line flagship product when it comes to performance. And the moment you start doing this, then all of a sudden you're competing with the Forerunner, right? So you may have cannibalization. Cannibalization is when you take share or business from your own or from another product from your company. So they need to be careful with that, unless they're planning to maybe discontinue the Forerunner and just focus, which would be a big mistake too, because the Forerunner has stronger brand equity. Okay, I don't want to get, you know, so it really is about the consumer mind. And we'll talk more about that when we go into branding. So let's talk about products or services. So we have this concept of augmented product. So what does augmented mean? Well, augmented, so let's look at an example. So you have basic credit card, right? But American Express offers so much more. So that's an augmented product or service. Or another example is Apple, right? So you have this is the actual product, but then you have the actual product meaning features, brand design, but then you have augmented product being delivery, product support, warranty, after sales service. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing that we're looking at when we make product decisions is breadth and depth. And breadth is different lines of products, so probably easier here to see it as an example. So you have iPhone, Mac, iPad, and so on. So these are your different products. And then depth is all the different versions of your product. And this is crucial because if you go way too far and have too many different versions, then you may run into problems, which was the issue that Apple had early on. And that's when Steve Jobs comes in and says, eliminate 75% of the products. And if you notice, even today, they don't have that many products. And when the iPhone comes out, it's usually like three versions. This is actually the older version. So it's usually two or three versions, not many. And why is that the case? Well, because maybe you don't need that many versions in terms of customer requirements or ability to configure. If you make things that are very different, then you're going to have a very complicated operation. Competitive impact. So sometimes you're launching a new product because you want to preempt your competition. Preempting your competition is you know your competition is coming with something that you don't have, so you preempt them by coming out with something that will allow you to defend that position. So in the case of Apple, they know, for example, that Google or Samsung are coming with a superior camera. They preempt that by coming out with a better camera themselves. A point of sustainable differentiation. So again, competitive impact is all about differentiation. Preempting has to do with first mover advantage. Okay, so you want to make sure they don't gain a first mover advantage. Legitimacy, product type, price point. So this is what I was talking about with a Land Cruiser, right? Land Cruiser is being always top of the line. So if you all of a sudden put a price point that is much lower, then now you're competing with forerunners and others that are in that SUV segment. Category size and impact. So if you're going to introduce a new product, is it really something that has a big potential? Cannibalization. This is what we're talking about. Going back again to the whole Land Cruiser Forerunner. If all of a sudden the Land Cruiser starts eating all your sales of Forerunner and you have no net incremental volume, so basically the incremental sales of the Forerunner and the Land Cruiser are now the same that what you had for the Forerunner itself, then you didn't achieve anything. You basically did cannibalization, which is really bad because maybe your higher margin product was the Forerunner for economies of scale. Brand equity, does it get diluted? So again, going back to the Land Cruiser example, Land Cruiser, this is my biggest concern that they are going to dilute their brand equity. Being top of the line, and all of a sudden you go down. This happened to Mercedes when they started introducing the lower price models that kind of affected negatively their brand equity or their image, their luxury image. Cost of variety versus scale of opportunity. Sometimes when you have a lot of variety, that has major issues on your production and supply chain. So this is what was going on with Apple. They just couldn't, basically have so many different products because it had major issues in the supply chain. So when I worked at P&G, especially in hair care, then you have a lot of SKUs, and supply chain was always pushing back because that means higher inventories. Had major issues in terms of cash flow, so finance would be affected. Collaborators. So here is okay. Are you launching this product because a collaborator, like a retailer, asked for it? So perfect example of this was Costco. When I was at P&G, they required these larger sizes. So we have these huge Pantene bottles, pumps that now are actually even used in Walmart. So there was a reason to have them. Actually, it was a requirement. If we didn't have them, they wouldn't sell our products. So, talk about bargaining power. So then we have these five innovation attributes. This is another framework. Does it really have an advantage? Is it compatible with the rest of the things you do? Does it add complexity? Okay. Can people try your new product? Is the early adopter visible? So these are, again, I'm showing you this because there are different frameworks that are used, and these are the most common ones. So at the end of the day, you're really trying to justify having this new product because there is a trade off. The more depth, the more complex your operation gets, and it affects negatively your supply chain, and it could affect negatively your cash flow. So you really want to figure out if you really want to do that or not. Let's talk a little bit about new product introductions. So new product introductions are now following very much what startups do. And the main framework used for startup is what is called the lean startup. And this was basically developed by Eric Ries. And you start with a vision, develop MVPs, test them, learn from them, and then either persevere, pivot, or perish. So pivoting means maybe you go different markets, maybe you change different features. Persevere, again, you keep on going and you try to reach product market fit, which is basically what allows you to scale. The other option is perish. This is not working, you know, even if you are doing everything and pivoting and you're still not getting what is called product market fit, which is you have a substantial market that you can potentially sell your product at a profit. Okay, then that is the characteristic of product market fit, and then how to scale. Can you get to those early majority from the early adopter? Can you cross that chasm? And that is the basis of my entrepreneurial marketing class. So let's talk about branding and brand equity, right? So my favorite marketer, or favorite pretty much everything, Steve Jobs. So he realized when he came back to Apple that, oh my God, these companies are going to go out of business. And we have a big issue here, right? Because brands disappear over time if you don't stay relevant. And they didn't have any new products. So they came up. So first of all, they eliminated, 70% of their products, just kept two. So they needed something. So it was an advertising campaign called Think Different. But Think Different was not only for customers, it was also for the employees. The employees in the firm needed to think differently because everybody was focused on computers. And because of this brand culture element of thinking different, is why they evolve. And now the number one product is a phone, the iPhone. In terms of the story, so this should probably be here. It took like a year and a half to find a product that was distinctive enough to launch. But early on, the only thing they could do was this advertising campaign. So let's go first through the basics of branding. Of course, it's a name, a logo. By the way, I don't know why people spend so much time trying to come up with some creative name. The most famous brands are brands, Apple. Come on, I mean, I don't know. Maybe Wozniak and Jobs were eating an apple, and that's how they. Or maybe they thought of Newton and Apple, whatever. Nike is some Greek god, and then the swoosh, it was developed by some college students for a few $100s. And what is funny is that you have startups or new companies that want to change these brands and logos constantly. It only benefits the branding agency. And the most famous brands barely change over time. The Mercedes logo or Tide or all of these brands don't change that much over time. Coca-Cola has barely changed in 100 years. So you have a trade dress, which is kind of the bottle. Okay. Um, I don't know what that is. So you have generic products. These are basically no brand. Okay, so think of generic medications. Private label are the store brands, and then you have the manufacturer brands, which we're all familiar with. So essentially, we have line extensions, brand extensions. So let's focus on that first. Line extension is just a new version within the same category of the same brand. So this is, Cheerios chocolate flavor, right? Um, Brand extension is using the same brand but going into a completely different category. So in the case of Tide, maybe that Tide brush, it's a different category. Still within laundry, but it's a different category, right? Or Colgate actually is a great example because Colgate has all these brands. Do we have the Colgate example here? So Colgate, you have the toothbrush, the mouthwash, the so the toothbrush, the toothpaste. So they're all called Colgate, but they are all in different extensions. Multi-brand, this is kind of the P&G philosophy. For each product, distinctive product have a different brand and a different positioning, and manage each brand as if it were the only brand that you have. And then you have new brands, right? So these are brands that never existed in the past. Okay, so we talked about this already. Packaging, as we talked about, is a lot more than just being for protection. A lot of the marketing is on the packaging. So Tide, what catches your attention, the color, the logo, because the product is just a blue liquid. Labels, especially the back labels, are out of time for regulation. So what is a brand at the end of the day? And this is a very important definition. A brand is a promise, okay, of what the company wants its consumers to do, gain, feel by using the product. Notice that it's do, how do they use it, what are they going to benefit, and how they're going to feel. So this kind of encompasses those three things that we talked about early on in terms of positioning, right? So we talked about features, benefits, and values. Values mean feel. So we have, and ultimately it's about building brand loyalty and brand equity. Brand equity, if you have very strong brand equity, then eventually you have leadership or large market shares and will be able to command higher prices. So we have few frameworks when it comes to branding, something that is a lot more functional. Functional is how to build a relationship based on characteristics or features or benefits. How do I know about this brand? So, often you start here in the awareness stage. Does it offer me something? So this is the relevance stage. So this goes from bottom to top. Can it deliver on that performance? So let's use an example for this. Okay. So I don't know. Um, New Tide fragrance free. Okay. So how do I know about it? You saw it in advertising, maybe saw it in the store. Does it offer me something relevant? Do I care about fragrance? If the answer is no, or maybe I like fragrance, then it's not relevant to me. So let's say, for allergic reasons, whatever you don't want fragrance. Then you use the product. So this is first month of truth, second month of truth. Does it deliver on its promise? The answer is yes. Well, is there an advantage on this product versus others? Maybe I'm using, I don't know, Woolite, which is also fragrance free and it's delicate and whatever. So is there an advantage? And the answer is with Tide, yes. It's superior stain removal cleaning. Okay. So here comes my PNG bias. And does it beat everything else? Well, but in all seriousness, it depends what you care. If it's delicate clothing, maybe you say, well, no, this what I care about woolite is probably better. But if you care about stain removal and all these things, then you have this special bonding. Because what you're looking for is you're looking for something that cleans but has no fragrance and does it better than everything else. So it all depends on that selling proposition, which we'll talk about what that is. Well, that's your most important value claim. Then we have this thing called resonance, brand resonance. So this has to do with meaning. Okay. So in this case, intense loyalty has to do with the relationship that you have with that brand. What about you and me? So think this is almost in terms of people, right? So you start with who are you, right? So deep, broad brand awareness. Always start awareness stage. But then what does it mean to me? Now, here we have a combination of performance and imagery. So, this is again, typically we have what we call the cognitive or thinking stage. And now we're progressively going into the feeling stage. Okay, so what about you? And this is imagery, judgment, feelings that you have about that particular brand. And if all these things resonate with you, so that's, the word resonate, is it meaningful? Then it's a relationship between you and me. So it starts with first, who are you? What are you? What about you that should care? And then, yeah, it's about you and me. Now we have a relationship, right? So that's almost why I say it's almost like people. So this is called the brand resonance framework. By the way, this a lot of this comes from Kotler, and this is developed by Millward Brown. So again, I wouldn't make you responsible to learn who developed all these things. So now let's jump into why is it that some brands are so valuable and some that were so valuable disappear. So we have the Young Rubicam brand asset valuator. And that is a very, very common framework used in the industry. And basically you have four factors. Differentiation, like it says, how are you different? How do you stand apart? Relevance, again, should I care? Is this something that I need? STEAM, which is perceived quality, and knowledge, which is awareness. So the way it works is the current situation of your brand really has to do with the STEAM, which is the perceived value, and knowledge with the awareness. But the future potential growth of your brand will depend on how well you maintain differentiation and relevance. So the way this framework works is you start here in this lower quadrant where you have low awareness and low perceived value because nobody knows you. But then, you have differentiation, right? And differentiation then goes into if you are different, then is it different, but is it relevant? So this is like an aspiring brand. And if you do, maybe you have some niche that you're able to tap. But then if you are able to increase your STEAM and knowledge, meaning awareness and perceived value of your brand, then you can reach leadership. So what often happens is you fall into mass market and commodity or erosion. This is when you start having problems. So what does that mean? That means so let's look at here an example. So here we have an example for Starbucks. Very early on, we did the Starbucks case study. Their main thing was differentiation, but they needed also to find something that was relevant. So Schultz had to make some changes. He couldn't just take the cafe model from Milan and just put it in Seattle and expect immediately that it would work because there was a need to make it relevant. So once he gained more differentiation and relevance, right? Now, now you have conquer a niche. So this is kind of what I was talking about before, um, when you're basically now going from being in the early adopters to early majority. Now to scale, you're going to need a lot of marketing, advertising, and so on, because now to scale, you need high levels of not only relevance and differentiation, which, for example, in the case of Bose, they had, right? But you also, and then relevance, because noise reduction or cancellation was very relevant to people in noisy places. But now you also have a lot of STEAM and knowledge, meaning awareness. So again, Starbucks, the same thing. Started as a niche player in Seattle, then it expanded quickly, and then once it went public and got a lot of funding, then that's when they were able to achieve leadership through a lot of awareness and opening a lot of new stores. The problem is when you start appearing in mass market. So some of these brands that we mentioned, I worry sometimes about Apple or even Starbucks because now you see them everywhere. And for me, when I think of mass, I think of Walmart. I don't, you know, if you're in Walmart, you're going to be associated sometimes with lower cost, lower quality. So that's why a lot of brands don't want to be in Walmart because it could affect their steam, meaning the perceived quality. The other thing, but where you really, really have a problem is when you start losing differentiation. Because if you're not that different and you're now in mass, then the next step could be that you become a commodity or even lose all differentiation. So this is exactly what happened to Bose. Noise cancellation, they lost that advantage or distinctiveness. And then Beats comes out with all of these different colors. And by the way, huge awareness and steam or knowledge and steam because of Dr. Dre. Good moment because Dr. Dre was with Eminem and they were at their peak. So this is why some of these brands disappear. To give you another perfect example of this, so you have you know, Magnavox, they were making great VCRs, but VCRs were not relevant anymore. The technology moved on and they stayed behind. They were not relevant anymore. All these brands, when flat screens came out, they stayed behind. And then this little brand called Samsung all of a sudden, stay ahead. Now, some brands like Sony have been able not only to survive, they do really well because they do have a good differentiation in terms of being higher quality and commanding a higher price. Okay, so that's the framework. Okay. So again, the hierarchy effects whenever you implement these new products is you start with awareness, then you go to trial, and hopefully if you get first moment of truth, second moment of truth, then and both are working, then you'll get repeat customers. There's actually now a third moment of truth, which Google came up with, which is digital. But we'll talk about that when we talk about digital. So typical sales and profit path. So when I joined P&G, they said to me, forget about this product life cycle. Your job is that we never decline. So if you're in the maturity stage, you have to figure out a way to keep growing. I think the best example of that is Coca-Cola, right? So they have been around for 150 years. So the whole purpose of marketing, in my opinion, is to avoid this. But sometimes it happens. I mean, I was acting brand manager of a detergent brand called Bold, and what happened is it lost distinctiveness. It had no real reason to exist because everything that Bold promised eventually was incorporated to Tide. So Bold was detergent and fabric softener all into one, like a two-in-one. Yeah, but once Downy was incorporated into Tide, there was no reason for Bold to exist. So yeah, even if you're the best marketer in the world, this sometimes is unavoidable. So that's it. So now an hour and 38 minutes. Okay, so that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable because now I was able to cover things at the right pace and the right level of detail. Okay, so hopefully this will be useful for you guys to prepare for the exam.